The wind moved slowly across the empty Wyoming street, lifting small clouds of dust and snow. Old wooden signs creaked above closed shops. The morning sun had just started to rise, throwing long, cold shadows across the town. But even in that quiet, even in that stillness, there was a name floating in the air, a name whispered by ranchers, cowboys, and lawmen, long after the man himself disappeared. That name was Dan Bogan. Some called him a troublemaker. Others called him a hero who stood up to the powerful. Many simply called him a ghost because one day he slipped out of America and no one ever truly saw him again. His story became a legend told around campfires and saloon tables. But behind the gunfights, behind the wanted posters, behind the whispers, was a real man. A man with a past, a man with a temper, and a man who spent his life trying to outrun the world closing in around him. This is his story. Dan Bogan was born around 1860, far from the famous cattle trails and saloons that would later shape his life. His early years were spent in the deep South in Alabama, during a time when the United States was struggling to rebuild after the Civil War. It was a hard world for a child to grow up in. Families were broken, money was scarce, and danger seemed to loom behind every fence post. Dan's family moved west when he was still young, like so many others, searching for better soil, better weather, and better luck. But luck was not a thing Dan found easily. As a boy, he wasn't very talkative. He watched the world more than he spoke about it. The other children noticed he had a stubborn look in his eyes, even when he was small. It was the look of someone who refused to be pushed around. When Dan first climbed onto a horse, something changed. The saddle felt like a place he belonged. The open land felt like home. He learned fast how to ride, how to rope, how to guide cattle from dawn until dark. And as he grew, riding became more than a job. It became a way of life. It became freedom. By his late teens, Dan had turned into a skilled cowboy. He could ride faster than most men on the range. He could handle a lasso with smooth, steady hands. And he could shoot with a sharp eye that almost never missed. But along with those talents came something else: his temper. Dan was not the kind of man who backed away from a fight. If someone insulted him, he stood his ground. If someone tried to control him, he pushed back. He was young, proud, and certain that no one had the right to own him. The older cowboys liked to say that Dan Bogan was born for open land and trouble. And as the years passed, trouble began to find him more often. The West was changing quickly. Big cattle companies were taking over large areas of land. Small ranchers' men who had worked the soil for years were being pushed out. Disagreements turned into confrontations. Confrontations turned into fights. It was a time when the difference between justice and survival was sometimes only the pull of a trigger. Dan didn't trust the powerful ranch owners. He didn't like the lawmen who worked for them. He sided with the small ranchers, the men with dust on their clothes and calluses on their hands, the men who didn't have much besides pride and a few head of cattle. This choice made Dan a target. Soon, people began accusing him of cattle stealing. Some said he was working with Russ. Others said he was simply a cowboy caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. Dan always denied those claims, and truthfully, nobody ever proved he stole anything. But the West was not a place that needed proof. Once a man was whispered about, that whisper could grow into a story, and that story could become a dangerous shadow following him from town to town. Dan found himself drifting first through Texas, then into New Mexico, and finally north into Wyoming. He tried to start fresh each time. He tried to work honestly, but no matter where he went, trouble found him. A fight in a saloon, an argument on a cattle drive, a disagreement with a sheriff. It always ended the same way. Dan riding out before things got worse. By the time he reached Laramie, Wyoming, Dan was known as a man with a fast gun and a short fuse. Yet the people who worked beside him said he wasn't bad. He was tough, yes. He was quick to defend himself, yes. But bad, hardly. He simply refused to bow down to anyone who tried to push him. But Laramie was different. It was a town full of tension, full of watchful eyes. And one of those eyes belonged to Constable Charles S. Gunn, a lawman who believed Dan was dangerous and needed to be controlled. Their paths were destined to collide. In the cold winter of 1887, the tension between Dan and Constable Gunn grew stronger with every passing day. Gunn wanted Dan arrested for previous incidents. Dan wanted Gunn to leave him alone. It was a simple conflictant till the moment it exploded into violence. A moment that would change Dan's life forever and turn him into the outlaw ghost the world still talks about. The story of that moment, of the gunshot that echoed across Laramie would carry Dan Bogan into legend. But to understand how he became that legend, we must look deeper into the choices, the fears, and the fire burning inside him. And so, the journey begins here, with a young man, a rising storm, and a destiny riding toward him like a horse at full gallop. The town of Laramie sat beneath a sky that always felt too wide, too empty, and too silent. It was the kind of place where a man's footsteps echoed long after he walked past, and his reputation traveled even faster than his boots. When Dan Bogan arrived in Laramie, he hoped the cold wind would carry away the whispers that had followed him through Texas and New Mexico. But the West had a long memory, and Laramie was not the fresh start he wanted. Dan tried to settle in. He worked as a cowboy on nearby ranches, riding the open range from dawn until the stars returned. He roped stray cattle, fixed fences, and worked hard like any honest man trying to build a future. But a man like Dan could never stay invisible for long. He was too skilled, too sharp, and too quick with his temper. And in a place like Laramie, that kind of man drew attention, especially from lawmen who were always looking for someone to blame. One of those lawmen was Constable Charles S. Gunn. Gunn wasn't a cruel man, but he was strict, serious, and determined to keep peace in Laramie no matter who he had to confront. To him, the world was simple. There were men who followed the rules, and men who didn't. And in Gunn's eyes, Dan Bogan fell firmly in the second group. It didn't take long for Gunn to hear about Dan's past, about the fights, the accusations, the heated words with ranch owners, the quick hand on the gun. None of it was proven, but Gunn wasn't a man who waited for proof. He believed instinct, and his instinct told him Don was dangerous. At first, their encounters were small and cold. A sharp look across the street, a warning spoken through tight lips, a moment of silence where both men knew they did not trust the other. Dan tried to ignore Gunn, but ignoring a lawman was like ignoring a storm cloud. The longer you looked away, the sooner it would strike. The trouble began in small ways. A cowboy would tell Gunn that Dan had been in a fight at a saloon. A ranch owner would complain that Dan had argued with him over wages. Then someone accused Dan of helping rustlers again, with no proof. But accusations were enough to raise Gunn's suspicions. Soon, Gunn was watching Dan every time he rode into town. Dan noticed. Don didn't like it. When two men with strong pride stare at each other long enough, something eventually breaks. One icy morning, Don was warming his hands by a stove inside a small general store. A few other cowboys were talking near the back, laughing about the weather and last night's card game. The door pushed open with a loud creak, and Constable Gunn stepped inside. The wind followed him like a warning. Gunn walked past the shelves, past the barrels of flour and nails, and stopped in front of Don. His hand rested near the grip of his revolver. Bogan, Gunn said quietly, "We need to talk." Dan turned slowly. His jaw tightened. "What about?" Gunn's voice stayed calm, but his eyes were sharp. "You're stirring up trouble again. This town doesn't need that. I'm telling you, now keep yourself clean. No fights, no arguments, no nonsense." Dan lifted his chin. "I'm not looking for trouble." "You don't have to look for it," Gunn replied. "You bring it with you." The room fell silent. The other cowboys stared at the floor. Nobody wanted to see what would happen next. Dan stepped forward, just enough for Gunn to notice. "I worked hard. I don't bother anyone who doesn't bother me. Leave me alone." Gunn's voice grew colder. "I'll leave you alone when you prove I can trust you." Dan's temper burned like dry grass catching fire. "You don't know me, and I don't owe you anything." Gunn didn't flinch. "You owe this town peace." Dan walked past him and shoved open the door, letting the cold wind rush in. That moment created a line between them, a line that neither man would ever cross back over. In the days that followed, the tension between Dan and Gunn grew heavier, like a storm building deep in the clouds. Dan tried to keep busy with ranch work, but every time he rode into town, Gunn's eyes followed him. People in Laramie started choosing sides. Some whispered that Dan was dangerous. Others said Gunn was pushing him too hard. But one thing everyone agreed on: something was going to happen. something big. One night, Don entered a saloon after a long day on the range. He ordered a drink and sat alone, hoping for a quiet moment. But 3 ranch hands started laughing loudly at the far end of the bar. Dan ignored them, but their voices grew louder and meaner. One of them shouted, "Hey Bogan, heard you're afraid of the constable?" Don stayed still. His fingers tightened around his glass. Another man added, "Gun's gonna lock you up one day if he doesn't shoot you first." Dan stood slowly. "You boys looking for a fight?" They scattered at once. They hadn't expected him to react. They just wanted to stir trouble. Trouble that would reach Gun's ears by morning, and it did. The next day, Gun confronted Dan again in the street. Voices rose. Tempers flared. Dan walked away before things exploded. But everyone watching knew it wouldn't end there. The West was changing. Lawmen were growing stricter. Ranch owners were growing bolder. And cowboys like Dan were being squeezed by a world that no longer had room for them. The fuse was burning. The powder was ready. And soon, a single spark would send Dan Bogan into the pages of history forever. The winter of 1887 settled over Laramie like a heavy blanket, thick with snow and quiet tension. The streets grew quieter, the nights colder, and tempers tighter. Every breath seemed to freeze in the air, and every sound felt sharper, heavier, as if the whole town knew something was coming, but didn't know when. Don Bogan felt it too. He woke every morning before sunrise, feeding horses and preparing for the long ride across the ranch lands. But even when he worked far from town, even when all he could hear were cattle lowing and the wind brushing over the grass, Dan felt the pressure building inside him, like a rope being pulled tighter and tighter around his chest. No matter how hard he worked or how quietly he tried to live, trouble clung to him like a shadow. Constable Gun was never far behind it. The cold weather didn't soften Gun's determination. If anything, winter made him sharper, more focused. He believed he was protecting Laramie from danger, protecting it from men like Dan. Gun watched the saloons, the stables, the general store, and every path leading in and out of town. And if Dan walked down one of those paths, Gun noticed that sometimes. Their eyes met across a snowy street, and neither man looked away. One morning, Dan stepped into a cafe to warm his hands and drink a cup of black coffee. The building smelled of fresh bread and damp coats. A pot-belly stove crackled in the center of the room. Dan took a seat in the corner and kept his hat low. He didn't want trouble. Not today, but trouble found him anyway. The door opened, letting in a burst of cold air, and then Constable Gun stepped inside. Every conversation in the cafe softened, then faded. People shifted in their chairs. The tension was so thick, it felt like the room itself was holding its breath. Gun scanned the cafe, saw Dan sitting alone, and walked toward him. Dan didn't move. He lifted his cup, took a slow sip, and waited. Gun stopped at his table. His tone was steady, but not friendly. "We need to settle something, Bogan." Dan's voice stayed calm. "I'm eating. Sit if you want. Talk if you want. But I'm not looking for a fight." Gun pulled out the chair across from him and sat, his coat dusted with snow. "There was trouble last night at the saloon." Dan sighed softly. "I wasn't part of it." "I didn't say you were," Gun replied. "But trouble follows you, and I can't have that." Dan set his cup down with a quiet thud. "I keep to myself." "That's not enough," Gun said. "You need to keep your distance from the wrong men. Rustlers, drunks, fighters." Don shook his head slowly. "I'm a cowboy. I work. I sleep. I ride. I don't go looking for trouble." Gun leaned forward. "Maybe you don't go looking for it, but you draw it like a magnet." Dan's eyes finally lifted. "Maybe you're the one drawing it to me." A long, cold silence stretched between them. Someone shuffled nervously in the corner. A fork clinked against a plate. Outside, the wind slammed against the cafe window. Then Gun spoke again, this time more directly. "I'm warning you, Bogan. If I hear your name involved in anything at Ali, we'll arrest you. Understand?" Don pushed back his chair and stood. "You do what you want, Gun, but I'm done talking." He walked out, leaving his coffee untouched. After that day, their conflict changed. It wasn't just irritation anymore. It wasn't just suspicion. It had become something harder, something more dangerous to strong-minded. men determined not to bend, and all of Laramie could feel the sparks as the days passed. Dan found himself looking over his shoulder more often. When he walked into a saloon, conversations dipped for a moment. When he rode into town, people watched from windows. They didn't know whether they feared Dan or feared what would happen between him and Gunn. One evening, Don entered the livery stable to check on his horse before heading home. The stable smelled of hay, sweat, and cold leather. As Dan brushed his mare's coat, he heard footsteps behind him. He turned and found 3 young ranch hands, standing a few feet away, the same ones who picked on him in the saloon days earlier. They weren't armed, but their smirks made his jaw tighten. "Evening, Bogan," one of them said. "Nice night to cause trouble." Dan kept brushing the horse. "Go home, boys." Another stepped closer. "Heard Constable Gunn's getting tired of you. Maybe we should help him out." Don turned slowly. "I'm telling you once. Leave." They didn't. The closest one grabbed Dan's coat, and in a flash, Dan reacted, grabbing the man's wrist, twisting it hard, and pushing him backward. He hit the stable wall with a grunt. The others stepped forward, fists ready. Don reached for his revolver, not to fire, but to make a point. "This ends now," he warned. The ranch hands froze. Then they backed away, muttering insults as they left. Dan holstered his gun, but he knew this incident would reach Gunn by morning. He was right. The next day, Gunn stepped into the main street, waving Dan down. His face was flushed with anger. "I warned you, Bogan. I told you to stay out of trouble." Dan shouted back, "They came after me. I didn't start anything." "Doesn't matter," Gunn snapped. "Trouble involves you. I step in." Dan's voice rose louder. "Then maybe you're the trouble." People stopped walking. Heads turned. The cold wind carried their words across the street like thrown knives. Gunn moved closer. "I will arrest you." Dan didn't move back. "Then try." The tension between them snapped like a rope under too much weight. From that moment on, there was no turning back. The town knew it. The men knew it. And deep inside, Dan and Gunn knew it too. 2 men. 1 grudge. 1 path leading to a deadly moment that neither could stop. The storm was finally ready to break. The days after, Dan and Gunn's heated argument felt heavier than the winter clouds hanging above Laramie. A strange mood settled over the town, quiet, cold, and tense, like everyone was waiting for something to happen. Even the wind seemed to move slower, as if it too sensed trouble brewing in the streets. Dan Bogan tried to go on with his work, but nothing felt normal anymore. Conversation stopped when he entered a room. Men glanced over their shoulders when he walked past. Even friends, who once shared drinks with him, began keeping their distance. It wasn't that. People hated Dan, many didn't, but they feared what was coming for him. And fear made people quiet. Every morning, Dan saddled his horse and rode out to the ranch, but his mind never stayed on his work. He found himself thinking of Constable Gunn more and more, of the warnings, of the threats, of the anger in Gunn's eyes during their last confrontation. Dan felt trapped, like a wild horse cornered in a narrow canyon. He wanted peace. He didn't want to fight Gunn, but he also refused to be bullied, especially by a man who treated him like a criminal when he had done nothing wrong, at least. Nothing proven. Meanwhile, Constable Gunn grew more determined. He believed Dan was dangerous, unpredictable, and a threat to the town. Every report of a fight, every rumor whispered in a saloon, every story, no matter how small, tightened Gunn's focus on Bogan. The lawman convinced himself he was acting for justice. But some said Gunn wasn't just upholding the law. He was taking things personally. And when a man mixes duty with personal anger, the result is rarely peaceful. One evening, snow began falling again, covering the rooftops and turning Laramie's main street into a white, silent path. The saloon lights glowed like warm lanterns in the darkness, calling cowboys in for drinks and warmth. Don pushed open the swinging doors of the red front saloon. The room smelled of sawdust, whiskey, and wood smoke. A few men sat at tables, playing cards. Others leaned against the bar, blowing on their hands to warm them. Dan walked to the counter and ordered a simple drink, nothing strong. He didn't want trouble, not tonight. Yet trouble stood just 3 feet away. A man with a thin beard and narrow eyes stepped beside him. His voice was low, almost friendly, but there was a poison under it. "Evening, Bogan here. You're on Constable Gunn's mind again." Don didn't turn. "Ain't my problem what's in his mind." The man smiled faintly. "Word is, he's coming for you soon. Folks say you ought to leave town." Dan finally looked at him. "I'm not running. I've done nothing wrong. That never mattered much around here." The man shrugged. "Law wants someone to blame." "You're easy." Don didn't answer. He finished his drink, pushed the glass aside, and walked out into the cold night. Outside, the world was quiet, except for the crunch of his boots in the snow. Dan looked up at the dark sky, watching flakes fall slowly from the clouds. He felt small under so much cold and silence, like the world itself was pushing down on him. He whispered to himself, "Why can't they leave me be?" But the West wasn't a place that let proud men be. The next morning, Don woke early, restless and angry. He saddled his horse and rode into town, partly for supplies, partly because he wanted answers. He wanted to know why Gunn was still after him. As he walked down the main street, people stepped aside. A few nodded stiffly. Others avoided his eyes. Dan stopped outside the sheriff's office. Through the window, he saw Gunn sitting at his desk, writing something on a sheet of paper. The room was lit by a single lantern, casting long shadows across the walls. Dan hesitated, then stepped inside. The door creaked. Gunn looked up. For a moment, neither man spoke. Don broke the silence. "We need to talk." Gunn set down his pen. "You're pushing this too far," Dan said. "You keep looking for trouble where there is none." Gunn leaned back in his chair. "And you keep walking right into it." "That's not true," Dan said firmly. Gunn stood. His voice sharpened. "Men complain about you. They fear you. They say you carry that gun like you're ready to use it." Dan's jaw tightened. "I carry it to protect myself, same as any cowboy." Gunn stepped around the desk. "I've warned you more than once." Dan took a slow breath. "Then hear me now. I'm not your enemy." Gunn stopped only a few feet away. Their breath fogged the cold air between them. "You could be," Gunn said quietly. The words felt like a blow. Dan stared at him, not believing what he heard. "You're looking to make me one," Dan said. "You're trying to push me until something breaks." Gunn didn't answer. That silence was louder than any shout. Dan turned and walked out. Behind him, Gunn closed his office door with a thud. After that day, the town's tension hardened into something more dangerous. People whispered in saloons, in stables, in shops. They knew the situation couldn't continue like this. Something had to give. Some said Dan should leave. Some said Gunn should stand down. Most said they didn't want to see blood spilled on Laramie streets. But no one could change what fate had already set in motion. Two proud men. One town growing smaller by the day. A winter that refused to break. And somewhere ahead, hidden in the falling snow, a moment that would decide everything. Laramie was waiting for a spark, and soon it would come. The winter storms grew stronger as January crept further into Laramie. Snow piled against the wooden buildings, and the wind howled like a living thing moving through the empty streets. People hurried from door to door, wrapped in coats and scarves, leaning forward as if walking into the wind might push them back. Dan Bogan moved quietly through these days, keeping his head down and trying to avoid trouble. But trouble followed him like a hungry wolf. Everywhere he went, someone watched him. Someone whispered. Someone waited for a spark to become a fire. Dan felt it in his bones. A storm was coming, not just the kind that fell from the sky, but the kind that lived in two stubborn men with too much pride. Constable Gunn continued his watch. He checked saloons, stables, shops, and the dusty corners of town like he expected Dan to leap from the shadows. Gunn's voice carried through the streets, warnings, threats, and hard statements spoken through tight teeth. Some men said Gunn was working too hard. Others said he wasn't working hard enough. But all agreed he was determined. Too determined. Meanwhile, Don was growing tired of looking over his shoulder. Tired of the whispers. Tired of Gunn watching him like he was already convicted of a crime. He wanted to leave, but something inside him refused to run. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was stubbornness. Maybe it was the simple fact that the West had never been fair to him. And this time, he wouldn't back down. But the West didn't care what he wanted. One night, snow came down heavier than before. The wind roared through the alleys, and the cold hammered against the windows of every building in Laramie. Inside the red front saloon, men gathered around the fire, warming their hands and sharing rumors. Don sat alone at a table near the back. His hat sat low on his forehead, but his eyes were wide open, sharp and alert. He didn't trust the room, not anymore. He felt the chill not from the cold, but from the tension filling the town. A man stepped up to his table, an older cowboy, someone Dan knew from the ranch. "Mind if I sit?" he asked Dot. Don nodded. The man lowered himself into the chair and leaned in close. "You need to be careful," he whispered. "Gun's been talking again. Says he's had enough. Says he'll arrest you soon." Dan's jaw tightened. "Arrest me for what?" "Doesn't matter," the man said. "Some lawmen don't need reasons. They just need someone to blame." Dan looked down at his hands. "I'm not looking to fight him. I never was." "I know that," the man said. "But Gun doesn't see it that way." Dan didn't reply. The man sighed, stood up, and walked away. Don stayed at the table, staring at the wood grain as if it held the answers he was searching for. After a long moment, he stood, pushed open the saloon doors, and stepped out into the bitter night. Snowflakes touched his face like cold sparks. The wind beat against his coat, but he didn't turn back. He walked down the main street, heading home, thinking hard about what might come next. Across town, Constable Gunn stood beside the sheriff's office, collar pulled up against the wind, his boots buried in snow. He stared down the dark street, his breath rising in cold clouds. He wasn't looking for Dan, not tonight at least. That's what he told himself. But something inside him refused to rest. He thought of the complaints, the warnings, the warnings, the whispers from other ranchers. He thought of Dan's defiance, Dan's temper, Dan's refusal to bend. Gunn believed he was doing his job. He believed he was protecting Laramie from a problem waiting to explode. Yet deep down, another feeling controlled him, pride and anger. And when a man with a badge lets pride guide him, the badge becomes dangerous. The storm worsened over the next few days. By the time January 15th arrived, Laramie felt swallowed by winter. Snow covered rooftops like heavy blankets. Icicles hung off gutters like sharp knives. The streets were narrow paths carved through white walls. Dan woke early that morning. He sat on the edge of his bed, staring at his boots, his mind heavy with thoughts of Gunn and the warnings he'd heard. He didn't want to go into town, not today, but he needed supplies, and he needed to collect his pay. He dressed slowly, each movement heavy, and waited. Before stepping outside, he paused at his door, one hand resting on the frame. "I hope today's quiet," he whispered. But the West rarely granted such wishes. When Don reached town, the wind cut across the street like a blade. He walked toward a general store, boots crunching in the snow. A few men nodded as he passed. Others avoided his gaze. Inside the store, Don picked up coffee grounds, flour, and a small tin of matches. The shopkeeper looked nervous, but said nothing. Dan paid, tucked the items under his arm, and headed back outside, across the street. Constable Gunn stepped out of the sheriff's office. Their eyes met in the falling snow. The world paused. Don didn't move. Gunn didn't move. The snow fell between them like ashes from a dying fire. Neither man spoke. But everything about their stare said the same thing. This can't go on. A horse snorted nearby. A door slammed shut. Someone coughed. And still, neither man looked away. Finally, Gunn took a step forward. Dan's fingers twitched near his coat. The wind grew colder, as if nature itself sensed what was coming. This meeting wasn't a fight, not yet. It wasn't a confrontation, not yet. But it was the moment that locked their fates together. The moment that made the final spark unavoidable. To stubborn men. One narrow street, a town watching, a storm overhead. And soon, a single second would change everything. January 15th, 1887. A day the people of Laramie would remember for the rest of their lives. A day that began cold, quiet, and ordinary, and ended in a way no one expected. The winter storm had eased for a few hours, leaving behind a pale sky and hard-packed snow along the main street. Frost covered the windows of every shop. The town moved slowly, as if waking from a long, uneasy dream. Dan Bogan tried to start his morning like any other. He brewed a weak cup of coffee in his rented room, pulled on his coat, and checked the bullets in his revolver more out of habit than fear. He didn't want trouble, not today, but there was a weight in his chest, a warning he couldn't shake. He stepped outside and breathed in the sharp, winter air. The cold bit at his skin, but he pushed forward, heading into town for supplies and work matters. His boots left deep prints in the snow as he walked through the quiet streets. Dan kept his head down, but inside, his mind ran wild. Every confrontation with Constable Gunn replayed in his thoughts. Every warning, every stare, every moment the two men stood inches apart, both too proud to step back. Dan didn't want to fight Gunn, but he feared Gunn wouldn't give him a choice. Across town, Constable Charles S. Gunn moved through the sheriff's office with a stiff, uneasy energy. He tried to focus on paperwork, but his hands were restless. He checked his revolver twice. He paced. He stared out the window at the street that was slowly filling with people going about their morning. Gunn wasn't a man who sought violence, but he was a man who believed in control, strong control, and Dan Bogan represented everything he thought threatened that control. To Gunn, Dan was a spark that could ignite chaos. To Gunn, handling Dan wasn't just duty, it was personal, and today, the pressure of weeks of tension felt ready to burst. Around mid-morning, Dan walked toward a small general store. Inside, he picked up a bag of flour, a tin of coffee, and a strip of dried meat. The storekeeper watched him carefully, but said nothing. Don nodded politely, paid for the items, and stepped outside. The cold hit him like a wall. He turned toward his horse, tied to a post a few steps away. But before he could reach it, a voice cut through the morning air. Bogan. Dan stopped. Every muscle in his body tightened. He turned slowly. Constable Gunn stood across the street, snow swirling around him like a warning. His coat was buttoned tight, his eyes fierce, his boots planted firmly in the frozen ground. Don didn't move. What do you want? Gunn walked forward, one heavy step at a time. Your time is up, Gunn said. I warned you. I told you to keep out of trouble. Don shook his head. I haven't done a thing. You're pushing this too far. Gunn stopped only a few feet away. Hand over your revolver, he ordered. Dan's heart pounded deep in his chest. I'm not giving you my gun. I've broken no law. That's not for you to decide, Gunn growled. Hand it over now. The street went silent. People nearby froze where they stood. A man carrying firewood stopped in place. A woman pulling her child along the sidewalk held her breath. Everyone felt the air change, from cold to dangerous. Don stepped back once. Just once. Gunn's hand dropped to his holster. Don't do it, Dan warned. Don't draw on me. But Gunn believed this was the moment to assert his authority. He believed this was the time to put an end to the rising tension. He believed his badge gave him the right to act first, and so he reached for his gun slowly, deliberately. His fingers curled around the grip. Dan's instincts screamed inside him. He had seen this movement 100 times in saloons, on the range, in fights with drunk cowboys. He knew when a man intended to draw, and Gunn, whether right or wrong, looked ready to fire. Don dropped his supplies in the snow. His hand moved to his own revolver, heart thundering, breath sharp and fast. Gun. Dan shouted, stop. But Gunn didn't stop. He pulled. Or maybe he only meant to pull. Maybe he intended to scare Dan, not shoot him. Maybe he just wanted to prove he was in charge. But in the heat of that moment, with fear rising, pride blazing, and the whole town watching, intent didn't matter. Dan saw the gun moving. He reacted in a flash. His revolver cleared leather faster than most men could blink. A single shot exploded through the street. The sound cracked across Laramie like a splitting tree. Constable Gunn staggered. He fell backward, hitting the snow with a dull thud, the breath leaving his body in a cloud of white. Silence swallowed the street. Gunn's revolver slipped from his hand and landed beside him. His eyes stared at the gray winter sky, empty and unmoving. Dan stood frozen, his gun still raised, smoke curling from the barrel. He had never wanted this. He had never planned this. But it had happened. Constable Charles S. Gunn, the man who had pushed him, chased him, threatened him, was dead. Dan lowered his gun slowly, as if gravity itself resisted the motion. His chest rose and fell in quick, shaky breaths. His mind spun in disbelief. People stepped out of doorways. Men rushed toward Gunn. Someone shouted for help. Someone else shouted Dan's name with fear. Dan stepped back. His boots slipped in the snow. He knew instantly that his life had changed forever. There was no trial that would save him. No explanation that would clear him. No sheriff willing to believe his side of the story. He had killed a lawman, and the West never forgave that. Don turned, sprinted toward his horse, and untied the reins with trembling hands. Snow whipped around him as he mounted in one quick motion. He kicked his heels and rode hard out of town, out into the white-covered plains, away from the dead man lying on the street. The wind swallowed him. The storm hit him, and within minutes, Dan Bogan was gone, a ghost fleeing into the blizzard. The wind roared across the open plains as if the whole world were crying out. Snowflakes whipped through the air in fast, sharp spirals, stinging Dan Bogan's face as he rode into the blizzard. His horse's hooves pounded against the frozen earth, kicking up clouds of icy powder behind them. Dan didn't look back. He COULDN, single quotes T. Dot behind him, the town of Laramie was already filling with shoutsmen yelling for help, for justice, for guns, for horses. News of Constable Gunn's death spread through the streets like wildfire. Every door flew open. Every horse was saddled. Every lawman in the county was preparing to go after him. Don knew one thing was painful. Clarity he could never return. The cold tore through his coat as he leaned low over his horse's neck, urging the animal faster. He didn't know where he was riding, only that he had to stay ahead of the men who would soon fill the plains behind him. Men who would shoot first, question later. His heart pounded as hard as the galloping hooves beneath him. His mind replayed the moment again, and a gun reaching for his gun. Dan yelling for him to stop. A flash of metal. A split second of fear. A single bullet. And then Gun falling into the snow. Don squeezed his eyes shut for a moment, fighting the image. He didn't want to kill Gun. He didn't even truly hate him. But both men had been too proud, too stubborn, and too angry to step away from the rising storm. And now one of them was dead, and the other was running for his life. The wind howled louder, as if trying to push Dan back toward the town he had left behind. But he pushed forward, deeper into the chaos of snow and cold. After nearly an hour of hard riding, Dan slowed his horse near a cluster of trees. The branches bent low under the weight of snow, creating a small shelter from the wind. Dan pulled his horse beneath them and slid off the saddle, breathing hard. His hands trembled, not only from the cold, but from the shock of everything that had happened. His breath came in quick, sharp gasps that fogged the air. Dan pressed a hand to his forehead. What have I done? But there was no time to think, no time to regret. A distant sound echoed across the plains, the faint but unmistakable beat of multiple hooves. The posse was coming. Dan quickly checked his horse's legs and tightened the saddle. He pulled his coat close and wiped the snow from his hat brim. Then he mounted again and urged his horse back onto the open land. The blizzard grew thicker. Visibility dropped. Dan could barely see more than a few yards ahead. But that same blinding storm also worked in his favor. Hid his tracks, confused his trail, and slowed the men chasing him. The West had turned against him, but the storm fought at his side. Hours passed like minutes as Dan pushed through the blizzard. His face numbed, his fingers stiffened around the reins. His horse breathed heavily, steam rising from its nostrils. Don whispered softly, "Just a little more. We gotta keep going." Behind him, the posse struggled in the storm. Men cursed, horses stumbled, and the trail disappeared under the constant rush of snow. Some turned back, believing Dan would freeze before he ever got far. But Dan Bogan was stronger than he looked, and his will to survive was stronger still. By late afternoon, the wind began to ease. The sky grew brighter, though still gray. Dan found himself near a line of rocky, hills sharp, uneven, and half buried in ice. He guided his horse between two large boulders, searching for a place to rest. He found a small hollow, nothing more than a natural pocket in the rock, but enough to shield him from the wind. Dan climbed down, rubbed his horse's neck, and cleared a patch of snow to sit. His whole body shook from exhaustion. He hadn't eaten since morning. His lips were cracked from the cold. But worst of all was the weight pressing against his chest, the knowledge that he had killed a man. A lawman, a man with a family, a future, and a badge. Dan clenched his fists. It wasn't supposed to happen like that. He looked out at the snowy plains, stretching far behind him. Somewhere out there, men were still searching for him. Gunn's death meant they wouldn't stop Isaac. They wanted justice. Or revenge. Maybe both. As the sky darkened into evening, Dan forced himself to think ahead. He needed supplies, food, warmth, shelter. But most of all, he needed distance between him and the men chasing him. He knew one possible way out, south, toward Colorado, toward Texas, toward the borderlands, where a man could disappear if he moved. Fast enough, the idea settled in his mind like a cold stone. It was dangerous. The journey would be long and hard, especially in winter, but staying was not an option. Laramie was closed to him forever. He mounted his horse again, muscles aching with every movement. The cold bit at his skin, but he pushed the discomfort aside. He had no choice but to keep going. Night fell fully as he rode south, guided only by faint moonlight and the instinct of a man forced to run. Coyotes howled in the distance, their cries echoing across the frozen land. Dan understood his situation clearly. He was no longer just a cowboy with a temper. He was no longer a drifting worker looking for a place to belong. He was a fugitive, an outlaw, a man with a price on his head. And from this moment on, every mile he traveled was a mile against time, fate, and death. But as long as breath stayed in his lungs, Dan Bogan would keep riding. Dan Bogan rode south through the freezing night, the moon a faint silver coin hanging in a dark, restless sky. The wind cut at his face, and the cold sank deep into his bones. But he didn't slow down. He knew that somewhere behind him, men were still searching, some for justice, some for revenge. And now that the storm had eased, his tracks would soon be easier to follow. Every mile mattered. His horse breathed heavy but steady. Steam rose from its nostrils, disappearing into the night. Dan rubbed the animal's neck as he rode. "Good girl. Just a little more," he whispered. Talking to the horse comforted him. In this moment, it was the only living soul he trusted. After hours of riding, Dan reached a small canyon, its walls tall and jagged, like the ribs of a giant buried under snow. He guided his horse through the narrow pass, hoping the rocky terrain would hide his trail. Inside the canyon, the wind softened. It was quiet enough for Dan to hear his own heartbeat again, a slow, heavy drum inside his chest. He stopped beneath a rocky ledge, slid off his horse, and let his legs rest. He had not slept since before the shooting. His eyes burned. His body trembled from cold and exhaustion. But he couldn't rest long. Every minute mattered. Dan scanned the canyon, listening for hoofbeats, voices, or the sound of rifles. But all he heard was the soft dripping of melting snow and the rough breathing of his horse. He crouched near a boulder and dropped his head into his hands. He whispered, "Why did it have to go this way?" He asked the question again and again, but no answer came. Only the cold, only the silence, only the memory of gun falling into the snow. Dan lifted his head and stared at the sky. "I didn't want it. I swear I didn't." He stood, shook the snow off his coat, and tightened the reins. He had to keep moving. Staying too long would mean being caught, and being caught meant death. Dan mounted his horse and headed south again, following the canyon until it opened into rolling plains. The first light of dawn touched the sky a pale, cold blue. His horse's hooves cracked the frozen ground with each step. By mid-morning, Dan reached the edge of a small settlement, just a handful of buildings, fences, and a windmill creaking in the light breeze. The place seemed abandoned, except for a thin trail of smoke rising from a chimney. Dan hesitated. He needed food. He needed water for his horse. But he also knew his face might already be known. Still, hunger won. He rode toward the settlement, stopping in front of a small cabin. The door opened, and an older woman stepped out, wrapped in a thick shawl. She looked at Dan with cautious eyes. "You lost, Mr." Dan lowered his hat. "Just need some water. Maybe a little food, if you can spare it." The woman studied him for a long moment. Then she nodded. "Come around back. There's a trough for your horse." Dan thanked her softly and led his horse behind the cabin. The animal drank eagerly. Dan splashed water on his own face, the cold hitting him like a slap. The woman stepped outside again. "You look like you've been riding through hell." Dan didn't lie. "I've had trouble." She lifted an eyebrow. "Trouble following you?" Dan hesitated. Yes, the woman didn't ask more. She simply handed him a small cloth bundle filled with bread and dried meat. Take it and keep moving. Folk passed through here last night, asking about a man riding hard through the storm. Dan's heart jumped. Lawmen, she shrugged. Didn't say, but they had hard eyes. Dan nodded gratefully. Thank you. You're kind, I'm practical, she replied. Trouble brings danger. Best you keep ahead of it. Don mounted his horse again, the bundle of food tucked into his coat. As he rode away, the woman watched with a look that mixed sympathy with fear. Dan understood. Wherever he went, trouble shadowed him like a second rider. By afternoon, he left a small settlement far behind. The land grew rougher, with hills rising like frozen waves around him. The sky darkened again, hinting at more snow. Don pushed on, but his body was weakening. His hands shook on the reins. His vision blurred. He blinked hard, trying to steady himself. He needed rest. Real rest. Ahead, he spotted a small cave carved into the side of a hill. Its opening was partly hidden by snow and dead brush. It wasn't much but enough to hide him for a few hours. Don guided his horse inside, lit a small fire, and collapsed near the flames. The warmth spread across his cold skin, and for the first time since the shooting, his body relaxed enough to sleep. He dreamed. He dreamed of Alabama, of being a child running barefoot through grass. He dreamed of Texas, riding horses under a warm sun. He dreamed of Laramie, of staring into Gun's eyes as the snow fell around them. He woke with a gasp. The fire had burned low. The cave was cold again, but he felt stronger. Clearer he stood and listened. Silence. Silence. Good Don packed his things and led his horse out of the cave. He climbed into the saddle with a slow, aching movement, then pointed himself south toward new lands, toward danger, toward whatever future still waited for him. Texas lay far ahead. Perhaps beyond that, Mexico. Perhaps beyond that, South America. A place where a man could vanish. A place where a man with a past like his could. Breathe again. Dan tightened his grip on the reins. He wasn't just running anymore. He was disappearing. Turning from a man into a myth, and then into a ghost. He kicked his horse gently. Let's ride. And together, they moved into the endless frontier, chasing freedom, fleeing death, and leaving behind the last pieces of a life that could never be reclaimed. The sun rose slowly across the dry plains of northern Texas, turning the sky into a soft mix of gold and pale blue. Dan Bogan rode through the quiet morning, his shadow stretching long behind him. The snowstorms of Wyoming were far to the north now. The air here was warmer, lighter, almost forgiving. But Dan knew better. The world wasn't forgiving. Not anymore. Not for a man like him. His clothes were worn, his coat frayed at the edges, and his horse moved with a tired but determined rhythm. Dan had been on the run for days, running from Laramie, from the law, from the bullet he never meant to fire. But he couldn't run from himself. Each mile felt heavier than the last. The memory of Constable Gun weighed on him like a stone tied to his chest. It was a moment he replayed over and over. Gun's hand moving, the flash of metal, fear rushing through Dan like lightning, the shot and the silence afterward. Dan swallowed hard every time the memory returned. He couldn't change what had happened, but he also couldn't accept it. He had acted out of fear, but fear didn't erase a dead man on the ground. As he rode deeper into Texas, the land broadened, opening into long stretches of grass, rolling hills, and distant towns that blended into the horizon. Few people traveled the smaller roads, and Dan planned to keep it that way. The less he was seen, the safer he was. By midday, Dan reached a stream that twisted through a small valley. He slid off his horse, letting it drink while he knelt beside the water. The reflection staring back at him looked older than he remembered, eyes shadowed, cheeks hollow, stubble thick along his jaw. He splashed cold water on his face, hoping to wash away the past. But the past clung to him like dust. He sat back against a rock and closed his eyes. The breeze brushed gently across the grass, carrying with it the distant calls of birds and the rustle of leaves. For a moment, he allowed himself to imagine a different life. A quiet ranch, a warm stove, a family, a place to belong. But when he opened his eyes again, he saw only the long road stretching ahead. He sighed. Ain't no peace for men like me. Before long, he was back in the saddle, moving south again. He passed small homesteads, lone cabins, and windmills, spinning lazily in the warm wind. He stayed clear of towns, slipping around them like a shadow. He avoided saloons, stores, and people. He slept in the open fields beneath the stars. He was becoming less a man, and more a wandering ghost. But the law was never far behind. Rumors traveled faster than riders. At a small ranch where he traded a spare knife for oats, two men whispered that a posse had crossed into Texas, asking questions about a dark-haired cowboy riding hard. At another tiny settlement, a blacksmith mentioned strangers looking for a man matching Dan's description. Dan thanked him quietly and rode on. He didn't panic. He didn't rush. But deep inside, something cold tightened around his heart. He couldn't stop. He couldn't slow down. He had to disappear before someone recognized his face. By evening, Dan found himself near a wide spread of desert brushland. The ground turned sandy, the air grew even warmer, and the sky stretched into endless orange waves as the sun dipped below the horizon. He set up camp near a cluster of rocks and shared a small piece of dried meat with his horse. The animal had carried him faithfully through storms, plains, and danger. He rubbed her neck softly. "You're all I got left," he whispered. As darkness settled, Dan watched the stars appear one by one. They were brighter here, clearer, as if offering guidance. But Don didn't believe in signs or fate. He believed in survival. Still, he wondered what the stars saw when they looked down at him. A killer, a runaway, or a man forced into a corner with no way out. Sleep came slowly. When he finally drifted off, he dreamed of voices calling his name, some angry, some begging, some lost in the sound of gunfire. He woke before dawn. Sweating despite the cool desert air, he sidled up and continued south. As he rode, he began hearing stories, strange stories that made him more alert than ever. Cowboys spoke of Americans heading to Mexico and beyond. Some went to escape old debts. Others fled from the law. A few even traveled across the ocean to South America, where ranching was booming and wages were good. Dan listened carefully. South America, far beyond Texas, far beyond the reach of us lawmen, far beyond anyone who knew his name. Could he go that far? Was it possible? The idea planted itself firmly in his mind. By the time he reached the outskirts of a border town, the decision was nearly made. He knew he couldn't stay in the United States, not safely. Too many men were hunting him. Too many eyes were watching. But Mexico, and beyond it, Argentina or Uruguay, a land where no one would know his face, where he could work the cattle ranges without fear, where he could live quiet, unnoticed, free. Dan tugged gently on the reins and looked south, toward the faint outline of hills that marked the border. "This is it," he whispered. "No turning back now." As he rode toward the unknown, the morning sun rose behind him, sending long shadows trailing across the desert to the world he left behind. Dan Bogan was no longer a cowboy, no longer a worker, no longer a man simply trying to survive. He was a fugitive, an outlaw, a ghost slipping away from America, and soon he would disappear so completely that the West would never truly know what became of him. Dan Bogan crossed into Mexico under a quiet sky, no fanfare, no chasing posse behind him, no gunfire splitting the air, just a tired horse, a determined man, and a long road stretching into a land where no one knew his name. The border town he rode through was dusty, small and peaceful. Vendors sat outside with baskets of fruit. Children played in the dirt streets. Old men leaned against worn-out walls, watching the stranger with the dark coat and distant eyes. Dan avoided their gaze, riding slowly through the narrow streets. He didn't speak Spanish, not enough to hold a real conversation, but he knew how to nod politely and keep moving. That was all he needed. He wasn't looking for friends. He wasn't looking for safety. He was looking for distance. Distance from Laramie, from the gunshot, from the echoes of a life he could never return to. He rode for days, passing through small villages and long stretches of open land. He bought food with the last of his American coins, slept beneath mesquite trees, and followed the stars. The sun was hotter here, the nights warmer, and each mile took him farther from the man he had been. When he reached a coastal place where the ocean stretched endlessly toward the horizon, Dan stood on the sand, and watched the waves roll in. Fishing boats rocked on the water. Seagulls cried overhead. The salty wind brushed across his tired face. He felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Stillness. For the first time since Gunn fell into the snow, Dan's breath came slow and calm. The ocean seemed to whisper something to him, an invitation, a chance, a new beginning. He stayed near the coast for a few days, working odd jobs. He helped fishermen drag nets onto the shore. He fed horses for a rancher who paid him in meals instead of money. He kept his gun hidden and never spoke of where he came from, but whispers travel fast, even across borders. One night, while Dan was sharpening a knife behind the stable, a man approached him. He was tall, with a wide-brimmed hat and a weathered face. He spoke in slow, careful English. "You're American," the man said. Don looked up tense. "Used to be," the man nodded, understanding more than he said. "You look like someone who needs work, maybe a place to go." Don didn't answer. The man continued, "I know ranch owners in Argentina. Big land, big herds. They pay good for strong riders. Don't ask questions. Don't care where you're from." Dan's heartbeat quickened. Argentina. He'd heard the stories. American cowboys heading there to work the great estancias, huge ranches that stretched across endless grasslands. Good pay, good horses, and no lawmen asking for your name. "Long way from here," Don muttered. The man smiled. "That's the point, isn't it?" Dan paused. His thoughts drifted back to Wyoming, snow falling, gun shouting. The gun flashing in the cold. Yes, distance was the point. He nodded slowly. "Tell me more." And so, within a week, Dan found himself aboard a small merchant ship loaded with supplies, heading south along the coast before crossing into deeper waters. The voyage was rough. The wooden deck creaked constantly. The ocean tossed the boat like a toy in a child's hands, but Dan didn't complain. Every day the ship moved forward was another day farther from the life he had destroyed. He leaned on the railing at night, staring into the endless black water. Sometimes he felt haunted by the past faces he left behind, voices calling his name, the weight of a badge staring at him from the snow. But with each passing mile, those memories grew quieter, like distant echoes fading into the wind. Weeks later, the coastline of Argentina appeared on the horizon, a land painted in gold by the evening sun, rolling fields stretching farther than the eye could see. Don stepped onto the shore, with tired legs and a nervous hope. He had made it, a new world, a world where the name Dan Bogan meant nothing. Within days, he found work on a large cattle ranch. The foreman looked him over strong shoulders, calm eyes, steady hands, and hired him without a second thought. Don worked from sunrise to sunset, riding long distances across the grasslands, rounding up herds, fixing fences, sleeping under the stars. The other cowboys accepted him quietly, sensing a man who carried heavy secrets but never caused trouble. He rarely spoke, but when he did, his voice was calm, almost gentle. The anger he once carried had been replaced by something softer, tiredness, perhaps, or wisdom. Years passed. Dan grew older, his hair turning darker with sun and lighter with age. He lived quietly, worked hard, and never once reached for his gun in anger again. The world around him changed. New ranchers arrived, new towns formed, new stories spread across the land, but none of those stories were about him. In Wyoming, the tale of Dan Bogan became legend. Some said he died in the blizzard. Some said he was captured and killed. Others swore he lived in Mexico under a false name. No one imagined the truth, that he had crossed an ocean and built a quiet life on the far side of the world, and Don never tried to correct them. Some stories were better left unfinished. On a warm evening many years later, Dan sat on a small hill overlooking the ranch. The sun dipped low behind the horizon, painting the sky red and gold. His horse grazed nearby. The wind carried the soft hum of distant cattle. Dan breathed deeply, filling his lungs with warm air. He wasn't the scared cowboy anymore. He wasn't the hunted outlaw. He wasn't the man who shot a lawman in the snow. Not here. Not now. Here, he was simply a ranch hand, a quiet man, a ghost who found peace in the one place the world couldn't reach him. As the last light faded, Dan whispered to himself, "I made it." The wind carried his words into the endless grasslands, and with them, the final trace of a man who once shook the Wild West, but chose to disappear into silence.